Hey guys, welcome to The Pursuit. I'm Jeff Hutchin. This is John Saborov, and we're on the relentless pursuit of truth and transformation. And today we have an incredible guest, a very dear friend of both John and I. Actually, John introduced Ira to me several years ago, and honestly, our intent was when we first asked Ira to be a part of The Pursuit and be on the show with us, we were going to talk about a book that he had written several years ago. Called Speak Softly, which is a fantastic book, which I think there's a lot of what he talks about in that book that actually applies to our topic today.
We may get into some of that book in today's conversation, in fact, to your point.
Yeah.
Around humility and...
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic.
And so Ira Williams is a great friend of ours. What's incredible is I like to surround myself with guys that are not only better looking than me in most cases, not in this particular case with you, but
thanks for
in
your
most
graciousness.
cases.
You allow me to hang out with you, and I appreciate that.
No, it's okay. It's part
Makes
of the gig.
me look better.
It's part of the gig. And but honestly, Ira is smarter than both you and I combined. Let's just face that fact right now.
Yeah, if we put both of our brains on this table, it would not be a case of A plus B equals C. There would be some sort of multiplier or something involved in that with the Hutch brain and the John brain.
Here's an example of this, and he's not going to like the fact that I'm going to say this, but he was a Stanford undergrad, and he was a Harvard postgrad, and there's nothing else I need to say. Yeah. So other than, Ira, welcome to the show, my man.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's obviously great to talk with you guys. I feel like there's a certain informality about this, but I'll try to keep it formal. And hello, gentlemen, nice to meet you.
No, let's hear on the
two of my best friends that I've talked to pretty darn regularly. But I'm glad. I appreciate the invite to join you guys in the pursuit, though.
You bet.
And err on the side of informality, no doubt, because the friends out there that we've got and kind of the format of this show, it's all about just kind of getting down into the real details of truth, right? Unadulterated, unmasked, and I think part of that carries with it a sense of unfiltered and informal.
You bet. Let's introduce the topic today, and I do this honestly with great trepidation in terms of what I'm about to introduce and what we're going to talk about, because the topic we're going to talk about is no joking matter. It's a very serious issue, and it is raised its ugly head once again in our nation recently with the unfortunate events that have unfolded in the life of George Floyd and all that took place with that horrific event that we all witnessed right there before our very eyes through the power of social media. And so as we began to set up our conversation today with Ira, what we decided we wanted to do is we wanted to tackle the difficult issues. We want to begin to talk about the racial tension that's existed for thousands of years. And so we're just going to go there. And let me just set a couple ground rules that we talked about. First of all, this is a very safe environment. The three of us know each other very well, and we care for each other deeply. And the place that we are really coming from as it relates to this topic is one of seeking first to understand before being understood. Because I think, and then maybe this is a good jumping off point for the conversation, and I'm just going to challenge you guys with this. I would say if we're honest with ourselves, every single one of us has racial bias. And we'd like to sit here and say, no, I don't see color. You're my brother. We have to be honest with ourselves. And that's part of the problem, is we need to begin to having honest conversations about this issue. And so how do you respond to the comment that I just made that all of us have racial bias? Ira, do you want to start with us?
Sure. I think you're right. I don't think there's any honest person that would not acknowledge that. And for me, the willingness to embrace that, I think, does come from a certain place of selflessness and not worrying as much about my own feelings or my own perception. And I think that's necessary for everybody. But yes, you absolutely have to. And even if they weren't racial prejudices or biases, we are human beings with pattern recognition. And you could say to yourself, well, I don't have a lot of experience with fill in the blank kind of people, place, whatever. But I do know this. And that, but I do know this is basically just pattern recognition, whether or not it's something you've experienced firsthand or something that you've been told or something that your quote people have told you over time. That is very real. And that does build biases and that does turn into prejudices. And there's no denying that everybody walks in and carries or walks into a relationship bringing those with them. So I think you're exactly right. The problem, and I think this is where you're going, is that it's often difficult to acknowledge that without feeling like I've just accused myself of something and now I'm, less than, and I need to go put on the sackcloth and ashes. No, I actually honestly think that if we can't be candid with ourselves, then there's no chance of us being, in a decent, healthy conversation about, as you said, really difficult topics.
My brain went there as well on the pattern side, Hutch, when you asked about bias. And we have grown up from as far back as we can remember with the idea that when we were taught bears roar, dogs bark, right? So there's this idea that I'm observing something and now I've seen enough of that pattern to make an assumption about the next dog that I see. It'd be very strange if that dog meowed. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So we then take, the mistake that we make is we take that frame of mind, that paradigm, into human relationships. Mm. And now we have built a narrative around a person. Maybe because of skin color, maybe because they have long hair versus short hair versus no hair. But the point is, we have this narrative. None of us want to be wrong. Intrinsically, inside, we have this idea that my thought is the right thought. My way is the right way, right? We just have that because it threatens us to not to think that maybe we're wrong about something, right? And so I think, Ira, and I want to hear your thought on this, but this idea that we project narrative and we look at pick out a certain aspect of a behavior and say, see, I told you that all people with long hair do that. We may not verbalize it, but I think inside of us, it's sort of, it sets into concrete this paradigm that we have about another person based on this narrative that we project on them. And do you see, is that something that you can identify with and maybe expound on?
I do, and I think, and I will say this at the outset, a lot of what I say today is the world according to Ira, right? So not necessarily trying to extrapolate into many broader truths than, what I know and what I've experienced firsthand. But John, I think you put your finger on it. And I think even more directly, we don't like to be wrong. We don't like to point a mirror at ourselves and see faults. If we are believers in the Most High God, we will freely admit that we have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But on a day-to-day, situation, just accuse somebody of anything. Accuse somebody of being angry. You've got an anger problem. No, I don't. Well, there you go, right? It's pretty easy to see that start to flare up. Likewise, to your point, if I'm being challenged on something I've always known, and again, this is human nature, or at least that I've always believed to be true, it is a huge mental, psychological even leap to say maybe what I've been told or maybe even what I've observed may not be the full story. Maybe I've been wrong about this. And to the kind of the broader question of the day, how, everyone's saying, how do we make this better? How do we start reconciliation? And we can talk about that a little bit later about what that process would even look like. But the first step has to be the acknowledgement that there is a problem and that problem is us. So that us has to be you, and it has to be me, and it has to be our fellow citizens. Because if we can't even get there, we can't start there and admit that I might be bringing some baggage to this situation, we're going to keep spinning our wheels. And I think that's ultimately at root for why we as a country continue to grapple with this. And it seems like every generation or so, it flares up again, and we make some progress, but then we fall back. Largely because we really have never had that honest self-assessment as a culture, as a nation, and freely acknowledge where we have sinned and fallen short.
Let's talk about what's unique, Ira, about this particular situation with George Floyd. as tragic as it is, and as brutal as it was that we saw unfold before our eyes, this certainly isn't the first time. It's happened over and over and over and over again. And those are just the ones we know about. Let's face it. Those are the ones that were captured on camera. There's many more, I'm sure, that have occurred that we've never seen, that were brushed under the rug, that we never heard about. But there's something about this one that's unique. I feel like, and we talked about this on the phone the other day in preparation for this session, is this one feels different to me. Now, and so let me ask this question first. Is this really about police brutality? Is that really at the root issue here?
That's an interesting question, Hutch, because that is clearly the I guess the accelerant, to use that analogy, right? So there's a flame, there's an accelerant, and now there's a raging fire. So there's no denying that. I think, though, that at root, what is fundamentally being revealed here is a worldview that did not, in Mr. Floyd's case, value his life anywhere close to that police officer's own life or the people that he cares about. And I can say this with some degree of caution and trepidation, but also, as the Bible says, judge the fruit. The fruit was he leaned on a man's neck until he died. Now, what was behind that? What was he thinking? There could be all sorts of analysis, and we can play that back later. But what was key is that he never thought of this as a person who deserved the level of grace or mercy or even health care and treatment that he should have, that Mr. Floyd deserved. Where does that come from? Now, again, I can't speak to that man's heart. I don't know him. But I can say that in a culture where there is a history going back 400 plus years now, that these people were not deemed to be even fully human in the Constitution, the original version of the Constitution. 3/5 was the number that was used in the original Constitution. So whether or not it's 3/5 today, again, let's not lose sight of the fact that there was at least a mindset on the part of that police officer that this person under my neck, under my knee, did not deserve any more grace and mercy than he gave. That to me is much more than police brutality, right? Because that can manifest itself in all sorts of other ways that have nothing to do with the police. It could be human interaction, just in the streets, in the hallways, in the elevators, right? And so, I, like most people of color of a certain age, have stories I can share where it has nothing to do with police brutality per se, but it absolutely has to do with prejudices, biases, presuppositions about who I am and what I do. You mentioned earlier, I don't spend a lot of time talking about my credentials and all that. But in this conversation, it's actually pretty relevant because it doesn't matter. When a police officer pulls me over, he's not asking for my resume. He's not looking at he might look at my stickers on my car, but that's not where his head is. He's seeing 50-something, actually he probably thinks I'm younger, but whatever, a young man who is of a certain size and certainly is an African-American. And the reason why I say that is I've seen the way they approach my car. So I pulled over, didn't see a red light or whatever else. I got it. That's my fault. I'll pull over, and looking in the rearview mirror, I see him approaching me hand on weapon with the scrutiny. And again, we're not talking about a traffic situation. We're looking at how is he approaching my car. So of course I've got the hands up, 10 and 2, license all ready to go. But I'm looking at his approach saying, what is he thinking is about to happen here? And why would he think that? Again, he doesn't know anything about me, and he doesn't know who I am, where I went to school, any of that. But the point is, it doesn't matter. At that moment, to go back to your original question, Hutch, this is not about police brutality per se. It is much more about a fundamental understanding and a valuing of life for people of color, as well as for people who are in the majority in this culture.
I want to talk about a story that happened to us. And the reason why I know Ira so well is because he has been a part of the Remnant Group, which, John, you're a part of, and there's several other guys. And we've got a group that meets down in Austin on a monthly basis. And I flew down there to meet with these gentlemen. And there's 5 or 6 guys in this particular group that was meeting. It's a group of CEOs and entrepreneurs. And we happened to be meeting at one of the guys' houses that lives in an affluent community in Austin, Texas, a gated community. And I remember I just got off the plane, I got my rental car, and I'm driving to the meeting. to meet these guys, and I happened to call Ira, and I knew he and Corey, who's another black guy that's a part of the group, were riding together. You guys were riding together to the meeting, and just catching up. Hey, looking forward to seeing you guys. It's gonna be a great meeting. Look forward to getting caught up. And come to find out, they were about 5 minutes behind me. And so I pull up to the guard gate. A white guard comes out. He says, "Sir, can I help you?" I said, "Yes, I have a meeting at the Feast House. It's at this address." And he said, "Okay, no problem. Have a good day." Punches the button. The gate opens. I drive through. I get to David's house, and I'm waiting for these guys to show up, waiting for you, Ira, to show up, you and Corey. And 15, 20 minutes go by. No Ira, no Corey. I'm like, what the heck? They were just like a couple minutes behind me. What happened? So sure enough, 15, 20 minutes later, you guys stroll in. And I go, "What happened?" And you're both kind of laughing, honestly. And I go, "What's going on?" He goes, "Well, we kind of got the shakedown at the guard shack." I said, what are you talking about? Mm-hmm. And I remember the look on you and Corey's face. You kind of laughed at me. And you might even have said something like, "Dude, you are so white. You have no idea." and I go, "What?" I go, "What?" Yeah, exactly. I go, "What happened?" He goes, "Well, it didn't go quite as easy as it went for you." And I remember I was appalled. But yet what I quickly discovered is this is a part of your everyday life.
Well, and could I, before I respond to that, I'd like to throw in the term that I definitely want to talk about either in this session or in one to follow, and it seems like a good point now. What you experienced was white privilege. And had you not had the back end of that conversation where you saw the discrepancy between how you were treated and how they were treated, see, in your mind and in my mind, that interaction was normal. "Hey, John, come on. Yeah, he's ready for you. Come on through," right? If I never hear the other side of that story, I don't know that that's not normal for someone else. So can we just bring this topic of white privilege to the table and talk about what it is? And Ira, in your mind, was that like that's a perfect example of white privilege? Or what, from your perspective, what does that look like?
So Hutch, it's a great example, and I'm glad you brought it up, because it is that case study that we all kind of are familiar with and know the situation. But what's interesting about the idea of privilege, just that word privilege, is that I think for some people it sounds like, and it carries a connotation of like financial privilege, like wealth, like, I grew up with a silver spoon in my mouth, so to speak. And I recently heard, I think it was Jimmy Kimmel was talking about his own kind of awareness of how he came to realize what white privilege really is, because he's from a pretty humble blue collar background as well. And he was like, "How dare you accuse me of that?" But here's the thing, and it goes specifically to that story. To me, privilege is often just a matter of easier access. And here's what I mean by that. You got through that gate without a second thought, maybe 5 seconds of conversation, off you go. That was the access that you were afforded. Corey and I rolled up, and again, of all the interactions I've had with guards and people in authority, it was probably on the more minor side of things, but it was still the hassle, and it was still the impedance of access, and it was still, how do you know this guy? Is he expecting you? How long do you think he'll be here? And again, I'm quite sure that was not a conversation you had. You kind of waved at him, said the guy's name, and off you went. So to me, the idea of privilege is not foreign. And I think sometimes it is a loaded term. And, my mom was a college English teacher, so I love words and I love the underlying meaning of words. But I'm also very sensitive to, if the underlying context of a word is going to throw you off, let's find some synonym and keep the conversation going. Mm-hmm. So the idea of white privilege sometimes makes people go, "Ooh," it's kind of like being called a racist. Whoa, hold on a second. Okay, let me put that aside. Let me find the word or the concept that will resonate with you. And sometimes just think of it as the access, the easier access. I have a really good friend who's a pastor in Dallas, Earl McClellan. You guys know him. And he had a great analogy I had not thought of before that kind of helped diffuse the kind of the race element of this, but also made it very clear how different the world would be. And he talked about how for most people, or in our, at least Western society, it's a right-handed oriented society. You reach out for a coffee mug, it's a right-handed mug. You write on a piece of paper, it's right-handed. You do it in a right-handed fashion. Left-handed people have to do this weird, unorthodox kind of adjustment to operate in this society. And it's a small kind of example, but if you think about how every time you do something as a left-handed person in this society, you end up having to make an adjustment. That's a microcosm. It's a small example, but it sometimes helps people realize that I never think about being right-handed because I am right-handed. But if I weren't, I'd have to make a constant adjustment. That to me is a great example of how it feels to not be white in a predominantly white society. It is often just a matter of the inconvenience factor, the extra burden of having to walk through life making adjustments every single day.
You know, we were talking earlier off air about a video that we both saw, we both experienced. I think even Ira has maybe had a chance to see this, but Emmanuel Acho, it was a powerful conversation. Matter of fact, very similar to the one we're having right now, where he was just basically on camera saying, listen, it's kind of a confessions of a black man. He was saying, listen, you can ask me any question you want, and I'm here to provide information. I'm here to have an open dialogue, and I want to address my answers to my white brothers and sisters that just don't know. They just don't understand the things that I go through as he's speaking in this way. And he shared it this way. He was talking about this issue of white privilege. And he said, you know, this is the example, this is the analogy I would provide for you. He said, it's like, let's say you and I were in a race together, right? A black guy against a white guy. And let's say it's a mile run, which you'd beat me because I hate running long distance, period. So I would have no chance. Either way, I hate running. Anyway, that's not the point.
Even if you got a head start.
The point is this. As a white guy, it would be like saying, okay, Jeff, you go. And I start the race, and I get 800 meters ahead of you. And then finally, they say, okay, Ira, now you can go. And now you're trying to catch up. And the only way that you're going to really be able to catch up is if they make me stop until you catch up, or they put you in a golf cart and drive you and catch you up to where I'm at, right? To really make it fair. And the problem is, this is my white mindset. Hey man, slavery's been over forever. You're free. You have freedom to go do whatever you want, to build whatever you want, to create whatever you want. But what I'm not realizing is you're 100 years behind the head start that I got. And that's white privilege.
It's a beautiful analogy, because that closing the gap, you know, we've all been in races. We've all, you know, had the situation of trying to play catch up. And as you said, you can't catch up. You can't close a gap unless there's some input from another source. Either slow you down, speed the other guy up, close the gap, shorten the race, however you want to put it. But the other thing I think is relevant here is we're not talking about kind of ancient history either. I heard somebody do some math recently, and they said that Harriet Tubman, this great slave-freeing, hero, she died in 1913. So in the 20th century, a slave, basically a slave rescuer died. My grandfather was born in 1915. So a couple of years gap there between a woman who went back and forth to the South to free slaves during the Civil, right after the Civil War, during the Civil War, up to and including the Civil War, I should say, is not that far away from my grandfather. And I'm 50 years old, so it's not like I'm ancient and he was ancient. This is all a generation or two ago. And so if you think about the whole, how fast does it take to close the gap in the race? Arguably, we've just started to even think about trying to close gaps and trying to address those kinds of privileges.
Ira, I've been thinking about this idea of white privilege as well, and from a couple of different aspects. One I think I already mentioned, but I'll say it again, is that my privilege is, to me, not a privilege. It's just normal. If you don't have my normal, you think my normal is a privilege. And so that's one of the reasons I think why white people in general, and I realize I'm generalizing, okay, have this sort of a reaction to the term white privilege, right? Because you're pointing out something, and so the indictment is not that this normal shouldn't be normal, but the indictment is I don't realize that my normal isn't your normal. So open your eyes, John, speaking to myself, right? The second aspect of this white privilege that I think, in speaking of, again, general terms as a white person and why you see this type of reaction, is because, Ira, black, white, old, young, especially, and I'm speaking primarily to men when I project this image, okay? We have a problem with ourselves. Okay, we look inside and say, I am so dissatisfied with the place that I'm at right now in my life. Okay, and to hear the term white privilege is yet another dagger in my chest that says you're not good enough, right? Because even with the privilege, you are still dissatisfied. You still haven't left a mark on the world. You still haven't done the things that you dreamed of doing, right? And so at a very human level, there is this aspect that when we say the term white privilege, it indicts ourselves down at the core of our being, down around where our purpose lives, because it's not letting us off the hook for not having for not being in the place that we should be with all of the privilege that we do have.
That's really well put, John. And I think this is ironically bringing it back to that topic of humility. One of the things when I wrote this book, in 2007, so this is, quite a while ago, and in 13 years, you start to see things and hear things differently. But one of the things I thought was notable at the time is I was really digging into this concept of what does it mean to be humble. And, the definition I was using at the time was a willingness to consider the needs and desires of others before your own. And I think that's still right. I might expand that to say, consider the needs and desires and burdens of others beyond your own. And the reason why I may add that little edit is that it kind of goes to what you said there, John. Like, if you're focused on yourself and how you've not measured up and you're not doing what you should be doing and you didn't use your privilege and you, well, there's no room for humility there. You have to be outwardly focused to have any hope of walking in a humble, in a humble manner. And I think some of what I was trying to get to with that book, and even when I talk about it today, is, the biggest problem we have is that we spend a lot of time thinking about ourselves, looking in the mirror at ourselves, critiquing ourselves. And that's also part of why we can't get out of our own way to think, well, gosh, maybe you're right. Maybe I have had a certain edge in life. Maybe I am making generalizations about other people. How can I be different? How can I change my mind? If there's one thing that I will say in the last week or so since the death in Minneapolis, it's how many people have been coming back to me and basically saying, these are my white friends, I feel like I need to talk. I feel like I need to listen, I should say. And I'd love to hear your perspective, Ira, on any number of topics. And part of it is a little bit, frankly, unnerving, if I'm honest, because I'm like, whoa. I don't want to spend, an hour with you and think you've got it all figured out, right? I mean, this is maybe the beginning of a conversation. But what I can do, and I have committed to doing with everybody who's willing to ask, is I will share my truth. I will share my reality. I will be as unvarnished, to use your term earlier, John, as possible to make sure that you're not missing what I'm saying about the state of affairs, especially with regard to race in this country. But the fact that you're asking is a good start. The fact that we're even having the conversation and you're starting to focus outwardly, not so much inwardly, is a good start for you, frankly, for any of us who are trying to be more humble, because that's what it takes. That's the perspective you have to even have any chance of going, I get it. I see now. I didn't realize that's what was happening.
So a couple days ago, during our prep call, I gave each of us an assignment. And that assignment was, between now and when we shoot this episode, I want you to be really self-aware. And I want you to, as you're watching the news, as you're scrolling through social media, as you're having conversations with other people, what images that you see, things that you hear, things that impress upon us, I want you to be aware of things that offend you, things that really bother you, that get in your crawl. And those are the kind of topics that I want to talk about. Now, we're not going to hit all of them in our time that we have on this episode. So for you, the listener viewer, this is going to be something that's going to be going for a while, and this conversation is going to continue for a long time. So I want to start us off with one that got me, and I would like to have a conversation about this. One of the things that's really bothered me over the last couple of nights as I'm watching the news is the rioting and the looting. And there's something inside of me that gets really angry when I see this, because I think it, in a lot of ways, in my mind, it's pulling away from the purpose and the cause, and what really needs the attention is pulling away from that. Unfortunately, the media tends to focus in on that, and we're not really talking about the issue at hand. We're documenting these crimes that are taking place. I have a theory, but before I share my theory, again, in the spirit of first seeking to understand before being understood, Ira, help me to understand what's going on there in the minds of these people.
Well, here's where I will definitely, sidestep the question a little bit and say, here's what I know and here's what I believe, but I would not dream of speaking, this is what is in the head of somebody who's out there in the streets campaigning. And I'm going to also make the caveat that let's assume that there is some portion of that population that is there for nothing but chaos and mayhem, right? So I'm going to put them aside. That's a whole different thing, a whole different motivation, and usually a whole different group of people. But if we're talking about people who are, frankly, so fed up and they're feeling like, I'm ready to lash out, in some ways, I feel like this is where being a parent has given me perspective that I would not have necessarily had otherwise. And it's not to say that only parents get this, but for me, that's what resonated. I know my children, and I know my children very, very well. I have known them for 23 and 19 years, respectively. I know when they're upset. I know when they are frustrated. I know when they are ready to actually be somewhat logical and talk something through, and when they're ready to lash out. Part of what I think starts to bother people, and I'm going to presume to speak for you for a second, Hutch, is that it's chaotic, it's disorderly, it's not the way things ought to be. And that may well be true, and I don't necessarily disagree with the idea that that's not orderly. I guess where I go, though, is if I saw my kids acting up and just throwing a tantrum, my first thought's going to be, what's going on here? Like, why is this tantrum even part of, why are we having this moment, right? And again, I'm not gonna, this will sound like a critique of you and having that assessment, but I don't want it to be that way. My first thought is gonna be, what is going on that's underlying this tantrum? Why are we having this moment right here? And obviously it's, when kids are younger, they don't necessarily have the way to articulate that, but that's almost the response I think we should have, which is, it's not great. And no one wants to see burning tires and, windows getting crushed. But let's, before we start to, spend too much time on that level of anger, what's underlying this? Why are we having this moment right now? I heard somebody, and I'm going to butcher the reference, but it's kind of like if you say, I understand that, Mr. Floyd died, but man, we got to stop these riots. Or if you said, these riots are terrible, but man, we got to stop people like Mr. Floyd getting killed. The statements are very, very similar, but the emphasis is reversed. And then the second way that I put that, it really does acknowledge that the bigger issue here is not the destruction of property. It's not the fact that there is chaos in the streets, whatever that means. It's the fact that it was prompted and precipitated by a heinous act that was so offensive that it pushed people to a place where they're saying, you know what? I'm so frustrated. I'm going to do things that are out of my normal character and the way I would normally do things. So I say all that to say this: it's not good. It's not something that anyone's celebrating, I don't think. But if we're really trying to understand that the root cause, we'll focus on why people are even prompted to do that. Because 2 weeks ago, nobody was out breaking stuff, rioting, or anything like that. So something happened in the last week and a half that has made this the best course of action for a percentage, relatively small percentage of our population. Let's talk about that. Let's understand that. And then from there, we'll be able to better understand and better address the destruction of property and other things that are incredibly important, but are not necessarily the primary topic of conversation right now. Does that make sense?
It does. I have some thoughts to respond to that, but go ahead.
So I love, and at the risk of, I take all of these lessons and the first thing that I do is say, okay, John, how can I apply that in my life? How am I doing the very thing that I'm frustrated or accusing somebody else of? Because normally I find the biggest enemy in me, right? So my thought around that is, wow, if I use that as, and again, asking forgiveness for oversimplifying it and turning it into a metaphor, okay? But the lesson in that, as I treat another human being forget rioting, forget racism, but the way that I handle another human being, when I look at them and I see frustration, Ira's example of parenting is fantastic, but can I give that person the benefit of the doubt to say, man, that guy must really, that just cut me off on the highway, have had a bad morning. Okay? How do I get myself in the skin of that other person to really feel what they might be feeling? And it's this idea, man, we were praying before this episode started. And I think we all went to a place of tears around God creating us a soft heart of empathy, where empathy isn't something that we have to generate or manufacture, but it's like, it's so on the surface of us, ready to come out, that we've been talking about the preeminent thing that's floating around inside of us, that empathy is the first thing, as opposed to why can't this riot stop? And I wanted to go shopping at Nordstrom's, by golly, and now I can't do it because of this riot. It's all about me, isn't it? Right? In that scenario.
Up till this morning, I had a different take on this, and I was spending some time with the Lord in preparation for some other things, and I really feel like the Lord spoke to me about this, and I want to get your guys' take on it. Prior to this morning, I thought in my mind that these were two separate actions. You have the protesters that are genuinely upset, and they desire change, and they're out there doing their thing, and then there's this other group of people that are the smash and grabbers. Right, the opportunists. They're just running in and go, hey, I see chaos. This is a chance for me to take something. And certainly that is happening. But I'm going to submit to you guys this, that I think the root issue behind both groups is the exact same thing. Because that young man and that young woman, by the way, the looters and the rioters, they're not black. They're black, they're white, they're yellow, they're every color under the rainbow if you this isn't a racial thing, this is everybody, right? Here's what I believe, and I think this is what the Lord showed me. What those people are playing out on the screen and running in and grabbing it, it's a relentless pursuit of hope. What we all share, the one thing that each of us has in common that I'll submit to you is the heartbeat of life is hope. And hope takes on a lot of forms. And there's a lot of counterfeits for hope. And let me just say this. This is what the Lord showed me this morning. I'm no different than that young man that runs into that Macy's and grabs a bag and runs out. How can I say that? I do the same thing, Ira, every day. I sit there and I go, you know what? My truck is 2 years old. And it doesn't smell good anymore. And the tires are getting a little bit worn. And I got a scratch on the side of it. And you know what my hope is? I find my hope in, I'm going to run out and I'm going to buy a new one. And that's going to fulfill me. And I'm going to feel better. Or you know what? For that guy out there that struggles with pornography, what's he buying into? He's buying into a false hope that when he turns on his computer screen and pulls up those videos and those images, that somehow, some way it's going to fulfill a hole that he has in his heart. And what's playing out with those young men and women that are running into those stores, it's a relentless pursuit of hope. They think somehow, some way that if I can get in there and grab as much stuff, it's some way it's going to fill me up. It's going to fill a hole of hope that I have in my heart. And I really believe that's the source of what we're seeing. I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a really powerful thought there that hope and my slight tweak on that is, the absence of something, that there's a gap being filled, be it hope, be it safety, be it, connection, sonship. All of those things are the deficits that each of us work with and live with. The difference is for you, for John, for me, there are other ways that are deemed to be more socially acceptable to fill those gaps, to meet that need for hope, to close to address that need. And yeah, I can't imagine myself being in that position necessarily, but I can absolutely imagine being so incredibly frustrated or so deficient in something that I took an action that in hindsight, I would look back going, what was I thinking? And I think all of us have those moments where we were going, in my right mind, so to speak, I would never do that. Or now that I've calmed down, I feel horrible about what I did. But in that moment, it's completely human nature to say, I'm going to take an action right now. And that action is going to make me feel that I'm doing something. I'm making something better than it is today, without regard for, appropriateness, if you will, or legality, or any of those sort of social mores. They will all take a back seat if we're feeling hurt and frustrated and put upon enough. And I think that's a great insight that the Lord put on your heart this morning.
I'm going to, at the risk of just echoing what you and I have just said, the way it's filtering in for me and the lesson that I'm taking out of this is I'm remembering the scripture that says hope deferred makes the heart sick. And that's exactly where I was going, is because and I'm going to pair it with another, not to make this a study in scripture, but I'm going to pair it with another verse. And it says that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh. Mm-hmm. Or, as we've said before, the feet runneth, or the fist swingeth. That these things that we're seeing are birthed out of heart. And when the heart lacks hope, as you're pointing out, i.e. is sick, what comes out is what we see.
I want to share a story with you guys that I think can summarize really well what we've talked about today. And I think this is probably a pretty good place to shut things down for this particular episode. And that is this. I as I was looking at scripture this morning, I really felt like the Lord was leading me to go to John chapter 4, and it's the story of the Samaritan woman. It's a powerful story of racism. If you've done any study of scripture and you understand the Samaritans, they were, when the Assyrians came and they captured Israel in 722 BC, and they took specifically control of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. And as they were holding them captive, they integrated into these Jewish tribes, they integrated a bunch of Gentiles from various different places in the world. They ended up intermarrying, and in the Jews' eyes, the other Jews, these people had become tainted. They saw them as a mongrel people and lesser people. 3/5 a person, 3/5 of a Jew, right? To use your analogy. And so as time progresses, they create their own culture. They create their own area. They have their own forms of worship. It says that they worshipped on Mount Gerizim, where the Jews went to Jerusalem, to the temple. And so what the Jewish people would do during this time is they would literally, if they were passing from north to south or south to north, there was a natural pathway that led right through Samaria. And the Jews would actually walk around Samaria. They would cross over the Jordan River, which is a pain. They'd walk north as they were heading up to Galilee from Jerusalem. They'd walk north and they'd cross back over the Jordan River, and then they would go into Galilee. They would literally walk around the territory because they didn't want to have anything to do with these people. What Jesus do? John chapter 4 says that Jesus was going to travel from Jerusalem up to Galilee. And instead of taking the long route, he decides, like Jesus would do, to attack the issue head on. And it says he comes into a small town, he and his disciples. His disciples leave to go get food, and he's at the well. And he meets the Samaritan woman. And Jesus says to her, "Hey, would you give me a drink of water?" And what's interesting to me, and it's not noted in the story, but you can note it by just what unfolds, the woman recognizes that Jesus is a Jew. So there must have been some sort of ethnic difference, is my guess. Whether it was dress or whether it was an outward appearance that she had or he had, there was some sort of a difference that was recognizable. Okay? And she says to him, why are you asking me for water? You're not even supposed to talk to me, right? So Jews didn't talk to Samaritans. They certainly didn't talk to Samaritan women. And here's Jesus having a conversation with this woman. And what does Jesus do? What he does is he looks inside of this woman and he sees her greatest need. He sees that she has no hope. And first of all, he puts it in the physical realm and he says, listen, woman, if you knew who I was and you knew what I had the ability to give you, the fact is I have the ability to give you water that you'll never thirst for again. Because here's the deal. He looks into her heart and he sees the greatest need that she has. And he's not speaking of the physical need for water. He's not speaking about that. He's speaking about a much deeper need. And for me, it's saying, you know what? You think you want that new truck. You think that new truck is going to be what you need. But what's going to happen is you're going to get that new truck and it's going to look good and it's going to feel good for a season. And guess what's going to happen? In a couple of years, you're going to come back and you're going to want another one. And he says, woman, you're going to come now to this well to get a drink of water. But the problem is, tomorrow you're going to need another glass of water. You're really not meeting the need that you're really seeking. And so what Jesus does in the midst of this racial conflict is he looks inside of this woman and he says, I know what your greatest hope is. I know what your greatest hope is. Your greatest hope is to realize who you truly are, who your true identity is, that you're a child of the King and you've been destined to live for eternity. It's not about what we see and we hear and we experience on this planet. Matter of fact, Scripture talks about, man, we're aliens to this world. This is not your home. So quit acting like it is. Instead, we need to put on spiritual eyes to be able to see as the spirit man sees and not as the physical sees. And I tell you, we got a long way to go in this conversation, Ira, and I appreciate your time here. And John, this has been great, man. This is just chapter 1. But where we need to start focusing on the only way change is going to happen is when we wake up to the fact that the hope that we really desire is not something this world can offer, but it's only what Jesus can provide. And that's found in our identity as sons and daughters of the God Most High. Scripture says, Romans 8:19, all of creation waits in eager expectation for me to wake up, for you to wake up to your identity as sons and daughters. And until we can get there, man, it's going to be a long road. And we're going to continue to face the stuff we're facing, aren't we, Ira?
That's right. That's exactly right.
All right. Hey, thank you for joining us today. Man, we could go for a couple more hours.
And you know what? We will.
Yeah.
This, Ira, open invitation, my friend.
And well, not I was just going to say, I appreciate that invitation, and I've both enjoyed this conversation, but I'm anxious to keep going because I think you guys have created an incredible forum, and this format is I think very powerful, and it's also very approachable. And so I think people will continue to seek this out. You know, this will be one of those things that gets shared and like, hey, they're having a pretty interesting dialogue over there on The Pursuit. You should check out this podcast. You should start watching this. So I'm grateful and honored and humbled that you guys would ask me to join.
Let me say this. This is actually a very good transition. Ira is going to be a regular contributor for The Pursuit. Do you mind talking about that?
Yeah. That's not news to you, is it, Ira? So, listen, The Pursuit wasn't birthed out of a heart of we have so much to share with the world, and if they could only think like we think, okay? This conversation is exactly what this ministry, this platform exists for, which is to understand and provide a place for diverse expression of worship, of conversation, of knowledge, of you fill in the blank, right? Because all of that is under the umbrella of what it takes to follow God as a son, as you laid out in Romans 8:19. And so we're inviting contributors like Ira to come on board and say, own this platform with us, because it's not about us. It's about the collective voice of truth in this generation as we relentlessly seek to follow after truth and transformation. And that truth and transformation isn't owned by us, is it?
That's right. No, we certainly, thank God.
Thank
we don't
God.
have the corner on the market on this thing.
Good Lord. We may need it the most.
So we're gonna have Ira on as a regular guest. Ira is going to be providing content of his own videos and blogs and vlogs and whatever OGs.
All the OGs.
All the OGs are going to be covered by Ira, and others. And so Ira, we're excited to hear what God is teaching you, what God is showing you, because the pursuit is just that. It's a bunch of people pursuing in the same direction, truth and transformation.
It's amazing. No, I was excited to talk about that with you guys. And what's interesting too, and I'll keep this short because I know we're trying to land the plane. I feel like the opportunity to flesh out some of those things that have been on our collective hearts, and this is, other folks who will be contributors, is for such a time as this, not to mix scriptures, but I mean, I feel like there are a lot of people with things to say and things to offer into the broader dialogue. And you guys have just created this fantastic forum and format that allows those to get out there and to start getting hashed out and understood. So I'm excited to see, how God moves through this ministry.
Right on. Hey, thanks for joining us today. Remember, jump on YouTube, subscribe. On the bell next to subscribe, click on that. You'll get an indicator every time we send out a new episode.
Also, hit our brand new website, thepursuitonline.com. There you'll also find a place to subscribe. Just drop your email address, if you would, in there so we can stay in more regular communication with you. There's tools and resources that are available on the website that aren't anywhere else like the YouTube channel. So make sure to do that and check out the website.
Hey, we'll see you next time on The Pursuit. Thanks for joining us.
See ya.